Now, in all my years of gaming, I don't think I've met a single gamer who hasn't at least read Tolkien, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, maybe even The Silmarillion, and I can't think of any gamer that I know who isn't a Tolkien fan. And where there's fans, we get podcasts. My own personal favourite is the Prancing Pony Podcast. And Alan and Sean, who present that show, have just released a new book. So today on Dragon's Teeth, we're looking at why we love Middle-earth. So Sean Marchese and Alan Sisto launched the podcast in 2016 with the aim of going through the whole of Tolkien's legendarium. So they started with the Silmarillion, then into the Hobbit, and they're currently working on Lord of the Rings. So what they do each episode is go through a few pages of the text and talk about the themes, what happens, but it's all done in it's a light-hearted way, but can still be very deep at times. You know, sometimes Tolkien studies can get very scholarly. You might find them a little dry. The aim of the Prancing Pony podcast, as the presenters say, is it's like friends chatting down the pub, and that's something that very much comes across. So as I say, it started in 2016. I discovered it in 2020. I think it was the first lockdown. During the summer, I was doing a lot of cycling around here, and I started listening to the Fellowship of the Ring, and there was something very nice about cycling through these leafy shire lanes around where I live and listening to Frodo and his friends have their adventures in the real Shire. The two things meshed very nicely. And just to give you an idea of how detailed this coverage is on the podcast, that was, say, 2020, Fellowship of the Ring, and just this last week or so, I've been listening to the episodes of Frodo and Sam at Mount Doom. So that gives you some idea of the scope of the podcast. Now, I know full well how much work goes into podcasts because I co-host two myself with my colleague Tim Mendes. One is the Innsmouth Book Club, looking at all types of weird fiction and film and so on. And the other is Strange Shadows, which focuses on the work of Clark Ashton Smith. So from a podcaster perspective, it's always interesting to hear how other people do things. And I have to say, I listen to tons of podcasts. I think the Prancing Pony is one of the most professional, but also accessible ones out there. Alan and Sean have been talking about the book for a while on the show, so it's excellent to finally get a copy. Let's have a look and see what's inside. Here we are then. Why We Love Middle-earth, an enthusiast's book about Tolkien, Middle-earth, and the Lord of the Rings fandom, by Sean Marchese and Alan Sisto. Now, you may or may not know that I'm also a publisher and an editor. I've put out about 20 non-fiction books and about the same number of fiction books through Innsmouth Gold. So the first thing I look at when I get any new book is the general physical aspects of it, the layout, the cover, how it's put together, and so on. And the first thing is, this is a really nice size book. It's a nice thick book and it's very cleanly laid out inside. I noticed that the text isn't justified, which is a little bit unusual. Normally, certainly for fiction books, the text is justified so all the lines are even. I don't know if that is maybe because this is a non-fiction book, but you know, the layout is very clean. We've got nice margins. It's easy to read. The illustrations are also excellent. These are by Emily Austin. So we've got the cover there, the actual Prancing Pony in, of course, and then there are various illustrations throughout. So we've got some sort of full page illustrations, the chapter headings or the different parts, and then there are other little sort of headings and pieces of art as well. So it looks great. The paper is fine. That's the physical aspects of the book. Oh, one thing I'm not so keen on is a matte cover. I always prefer a gloss finish on a cover. I just find with matte, I don't know if you can really see it on the camera there, but as soon as you pick it up, you get like thumb marks and finger marks on it. and this sort of matte finish can wear off a little bit. So I do prefer a good glossy cover myself. Aside from that, the actual layout and look of the book is excellent. Let's get into the contents then. So we've got some people talking about the book and the Prancing Pony podcast. Some of these names I recognise, they've been guests on the show and are fellow Tolkien enthusiasts and experts. And straight away we're into the introduction, which really gives us the backstory to our authors, how they each got into Tolkien, how they met each other, how they set up the Prancing Pony podcast. And then, of course, we're into some background on Tolkien himself. Now, of course, there are extensive biographies of Tolkien, but this is nicely detailed. You know, it gives you all the major points and events in Tolkien's life. And then we're straight into the books. Now, of course, there are films, there's video games, there's podcasts, there's all sorts of stuff, but the core of Tolkien fandom are the books. And we begin with The Hobbit. This chapter takes us through how The Hobbit was written, how it came about, the publication history, and Tolkien's influences, of course. As you may know, Tolkien was a scholar of languages, Anglo-Saxon history. I think he did a translation of Beowulf, for example. So he was a very well-respected academic in his own right, and a lot of that enthusiasm and knowledge went into the books. What we get pretty much in each part is a discussion of the topic at hand, in this case The Hobbit, and then this is nice, each of the authors says, like here, why Alan loves it, why Sean loves it. So this makes this book more personal. I think this is one of the real strengths of this book. It's not just a dry dissertation. You know, you can Google The Hobbit and you can look on Wikipedia or whatever and you can read all this stuff, but this gives it a more personal slant, because remember, after all, the title of the book, Why We Love Middle-earth. So this makes it much more interesting than just a dry read of events and history. Chapter 2, Sequel Schmequel, The Lord of the Rings. Because some people might say, well, isn't The Lord of the Rings a sequel to The Hobbit? Kind of. So this goes into all the background on the writing of Lord of the Rings and the publication history again, because of course it took some time, I think about 17 years or something, before it was ready to publish. And then of course Tolkien had to go back and look at The Hobbit again, just to make sure that everything matched up in each book. So as Tolkien wrote the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, he found it necessary to revise The Hobbit in order to bring it in line with the sequel. The portrayal of Gollum has been substantially altered. So that's all very interesting to see that background. And it's nice to see that Tolkien wasn't above revising his work as well. In fact, even The Lord of the Rings underwent some revisions. And we get some mentions of things like this. Yeah, pipeweed. So I won't go into detail on that there. You can read that for yourself. But there's always been some discussion about, let's say, what exactly pipeweed might be. Well, that is cleared up here as well. Chapter 3, I love this heading, So You Think You Can World Build. Now, as an author and as a gamer, we are sometimes asked to world build. We're setting up a D&D campaign perhaps, or we're writing a story set in our own particular time and place. Of course, for gaming there are supplements, but I think all of us at some point like to build our own world. And, well, Tolkien really is the great-great-grandfather of that kind of stuff, right? Because a lot of fantasy books now, you get a map in the front, which may or may not be a good thing. But with Tolkien, the map is really just the very small tip of a very large iceberg. Incredible depth in his world, of course. And the Silmarillion is the history of that world, all the way back to its creation, right up to the Third Age and Lord of the Rings. So that's what this chapter is all about. Now, of course, Tolkien continued writing throughout his whole life, putting new things in, revising, we can only wonder at the huge amount of notes and notebooks and everything else that he had. After his passing, it fell to his son Christopher to start collating and putting these together and getting them in a publishable form. Publishable, is that a word? I just made that up. So that means that although Tolkien has gone, his work continues in these later releases of things like The Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, and The Fall of Gondolin. So that's the next chapter. Again, how these were put together, the background to each. Chapter 6. Now, if you're new to Tolkien or quite new to Tolkien, the question might come up, where do I start? What do I read? Do you plunge straight into the Silmarillion? Where do you start? So that's what this next chapter is about. Some excellent advice here, and also talk about the history of Middle-earth, if you like. So it references other books such as The Nature of Middle-earth by Carl Hofstetter. There's a huge amount of supporting work for Tolkien's Legendarium that might be quite academic in terms of analysing the languages, or they are things like atlases of Middle-earth and so on. And there's also some of these other, well, some might say minor stories or books that Tolkien published, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, Farmer Giles of Ham, Roverandom, and so on. So this really does cover every aspect of Tolkien's work. That's part 1 of the book then, really covering the man and his work. Part 2, we now come into chapters on the various adaptations, and we start with changes. Another thing you get on the Prancing Pony Podcast, there's lots of song titles, particularly from the 70s and 80s, which, being the age I am, I do appreciate. What did Tolkien think about adaptations? Because there were potential projects in his lifetime to bring Lord of the Rings to the screen, for example. And the very first adaptation of Tolkien's work was a 12-episode dramatisation on BBC Radio's third programme in 1955. That was the only adaptation that was released during his lifetime. Chapter 8, we get into the first of the movie adaptations with Rankin Bass's The Hobbit, which I believe at the time was the most expensive animated film ever made. Yes, it cost $3 million, which was quite something for back then. Now, I won't go into all the detail here, but again, it's a thorough review of the film, the changes made to it, the missing elements, the things they get right, the things they get wrong. They make a nice point here. Obviously, there's some quite deep flaws with the film, but it's that thing of, if that's the first thing you saw, there's always an affection for that. So I'm a bit the same with the Ralph Bakshi film version, which I think is up in the next chapter. Yes, I had read Tolkien and Lord of the Rings by that time. I think that came out in about 77 or something like that. But this was one of those things, it got me at a certain age. And again, although it's a flawed film, it does have good points, it does have bad points. It holds a special affection because, I guess, the age that I saw it at. So from Rankin Bass, we go to Bakshi. So from there, we return to Rankin Bass again with Return of the King, which I have to say I've never seen, apart from 1 or 2 very short clips on YouTube. And from what I gather, it's quite a, shall we say, interesting adaptation. Shall we leave it at that? Again, the authors here go into a lot of nice detail. What it got wrong, what it got right. Did it get anything right? Well, perhaps. And the one addition to this is music. Right now, I know there are songs and poems in Lord of the Rings, but they're not sort of... it's not a musical. This Rankin Bass adaptation seems to treat the thing as a bit of a musical. Following that, then we're on to the big one, of course, the Peter Jackson adaptations, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And whatever you may think of those films, I think it's fair to say that Jackson's films really reignited interest in Tolkien and brought it perhaps to a newer and younger audience as well. Of course, it discusses the changes made in the films from the books. But there's this nice way that is applied is, sometimes is a change necessary if you're changing medium. So something that works in a book might not work so well in a film, for example. And of course, in a film, you don't have access to the characters' inner workings so much. In a book, we can be told what people are thinking. So there do have to be some changes made. And I think overall, certainly in Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson got those largely right, my personal opinion. There's some things I wasn't so keen on, but I think they do really work as Tolkien films. I sense there's a bit less love for Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy. Maybe I need to go back and rewatch those. I watched each one once. I really need to go back and watch the full editor's cut on those, I think. It seems on the surface that there were a lot more changes in The Hobbit as well. And there were some things that, I thought didn't work at all. Anyway, that's part 2. This takes us into part 3, which is talking about Tolkien fandom. Now, as I'm sure you'll know, of course, there is a Tolkien Society. There are various groups of fans that get together. There are conventions. There are moots. And this is something that has been going on for decades now. So it's one of probably the most well-established and maybe I'd say largest fandoms out in the various genres. The first thing we get here is to talk about collecting Tolkien. Now, of course, you can collect Tolkien books. I think I've got about 4 or 5 versions of Lord of the Rings. I've got 3 or 4 editions of The Hobbit. And these range from, things people gave to me as gifts, which are always nice to keep. Of course, you might be able to get, if you're lucky, some of the first editions. So, for example, in recent years, a first edition copy of The Hobbit sold at auction for £137,000, believed to be the most expensive Tolkien book ever sold. That had actually been signed by Tolkien himself and gifted to a former student. Imagine finding that if you're browsing around in a second-hand bookshop. And also, of course, as well as books, there's toys, figures, etc., etc. Toys and action figures based on The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings have been around since the 70s, when the first animated adaptations came out. From there we get on to Tolkien's languages, which we mentioned earlier. Of course, these are real languages. Tolkien was an expert linguist, and you can actually learn these languages, Quenya and Sindarin and so on. And again, there's advice here on, but where can I learn about all those weird runes and letters? It takes us through the development of the languages. And as listeners to the Prancing Pony will know, Sean is a very keen philologist, because Tolkien didn't only invent his own languages, he had a masterful use of the English language. So Lord of the Rings is peppered with, I guess, what we might call some archaic terms or old terms. And one very interesting section for me, and they also cover it in this book, is looking at some of those words and the background. Again, delving back into Tolkien's roots, be they Anglo-Saxon or Finnish, and so on. And the next chapter from there takes us into the more scholarly side of things, Tolkien studies. Again, there's a huge amount of work out there on all aspects of Tolkien, from his languages, as we were just discussing, through to his world building, how he actually puts his stories together, the sort of things he draws upon, old fairy tales and myths, and also the deeper themes of Tolkien. I guess the main one in The Lord of the Rings is the idea of fellowship and faith, and all these deeper themes that really, sometimes on a surface reading of Tolkien, you can miss. And this is another good thing about the podcast. It's a story about a couple of hobbits who get a magic ring and take it to Mount Doom, etc., etc. But that superficial story, is just the surface of some very deep themes that Tolkien explores, perhaps in some part drawing on his own experiences in the First World War, of course, and similar. We get some details of the various fan organisations and conferences. So the Tolkien Society mentioned there, and their regular moots, other organised fan groups. I guess the sort of growth of the internet has really spurred a lot of that as well. In fact, I think Alan and Sean first met on a Facebook group, I think I'm right in saying. So now, of course, we have access to fellow fans all over the world. Now, Tolkien was not keen on technology, as we know, but Chapter 18, not all technologies are evil, and we get into that discussion of online content. So this is a guide to some of the websites. Now, as the authors say here, it's impossible to cover every single Tolkien website because the nature of the web is such that it expands and expands, but it does point out the main ones, the ones that are still going, and you can look at these for reference, or of course you can join in chats and forums on those as well. And the Prancing Pony has a very active community on Discord and the various different social medias. So that's one aspect of social media. Another aspect of that, which I was pleased to see the guys talk about, is what we might call the negative aspect of social media, where we get into online abuse, or perhaps people trying to tie in Tolkien to various extreme political ideologies, or even just downright racism and so on. So I was very pleased to see the guys cover that. This is something that comes up in the podcast from time to time, of course, and it was good to see them call that out. I was also pleased to see that they mentioned video games in here. They don't really go into too much detail on those because, again, that's a whole separate subject in itself. But that does leave scope, perhaps, for a volume 2. And we finish with the afterword, which, as it turns out, writing a book is not entirely like writing a podcast after all. Yep, I can totally sympathise with that. And, of course, even in a book this size, this is still only, part of the story. So it's nice to see here. In this eventual follow-up, we intend to dive deeper into the rich themes of Tolkien, hope and despair, fate and free will, fellowship and community, and so much more. And, of course, there are new books coming out all the time as well, which they've not been able to cover in this volume. So at the time of publication, there are things coming out such as The Fall of Numenor and The Battle of Morden. So those are things that will potentially be covered in a volume 2. And one thing that they didn't cover in this that was a personal favourite of mine was the BBC radio adaptation by Brian Sibley. I thought that was one of the best adaptations, so I'm pleased to see they've got that in their sights, so to speak, as well as music. Composers, musicians, visual artists, cosplayers, crafting, cooking, brewing. These are all aspects of Middle-earth fandom that they'll be looking at in the future. So there we go. I'm really enjoying this book. It's one of those books you can dip into. You don't have to sit down and read it cover to cover. You can just choose a chapter or a few pages. And as you'd expect from the Prancing Pony guys, it's comprehensive, it's well written, it's entertaining and informative. So if you're a fan of the show, you know all this stuff. You've probably got your own copy already. If you haven't listened to the podcast, then please do. And I would absolutely recommend this book. If you're new to Tolkien, especially, or if you know someone who's new to Tolkien, it's a great introduction. But if you're someone who knows Tolkien pretty well, then there's still a lot to learn in here. So I'm very pleased to see that they're talking about doing a volume 2 as well, maybe exploring some of these areas more in depth and going on to all these other aspects of Tolkien fandom, of which there are very many. So I'm going to be keeping an eye out for that. If you've read the book, I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts. Do drop a comment below. Also, if you have any thoughts or questions on any Tolkien related stuff, I am a big Tolkien fan, but there are some issues I have as well, which we did talk about on the Innsmouth Book Club. I'll put a link up to that episode below. And also, of course, if you do like your weird fiction, do check out the Innsmouth Book Club and Strange Shadows. Of course, I'll also put a link below to the Prancing Pony podcast. That's it for today then. As always, thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone who subscribed. We're getting new subscribers coming in daily now. That's really nice to see and is really helping the channel to grow. As always, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe, and do let me know your Tolkien related thoughts. Perhaps one day we'll meet up at the Prancing Pony.